The evening flight from Denver to Seattle had been smooth and routine. Passengers relaxed in their seats, some watching movies, others quietly drifting to sleep. Among them was Emily Carter, a young rookie nurse traveling home after finishing a short medical training program in Colorado. She had only been a nurse for 6 months and still felt new to the profession. To Emily, this was just another quiet flight, a chance to rest before returning to her hospital in Washington. She leaned her head back against the seat and looked out the window at the endless blanket of clouds glowing softly under the fading evening sun. Everything felt calm, ordinary, and peaceful. But at 32,000 feet, everything suddenly changed. A thunderous bang exploded from somewhere beneath the aircraft, so loud it felt like the sky itself had cracked open, the plane jerky violently, causing drinks to spill and overhead bins to rattle. A few passengers screamed in shock, while others grabbed their armrests tightly. Emily's heart jumped as the aircraft shuddered again, this time longer and heavier. She could feel the vibration through the seat beneath her. Moments later, the steady hum of the engines faded into an unsettling silence. Something was terribly wrong, and everyone on board could feel it in that terrifying moment. Passengers exchanged nervous glances as the aircraft slowly tilted. The quiet cabin that had been filled with movie sounds and gentle chatter moments earlier was now thick with fear. A mother clutched her young daughter closer, while a businessman nervously looked toward the front of the plane. Emily straightened in her seat, instinctively alert. Years of medical training had taught her to recognize stress and fear in people quickly. She could already see panic building in the eyes of those around her. The plane seemed to glide strangely now, almost too quietly. The comforting roar of the engines was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that made every second feel longer. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were facing a nightmare scenario few crews ever encounter in their careers. Both engines had suddenly failed, leaving the aircraft powerless in the middle of the sky. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel as the captain tried to keep the plane stable. The co-pilot immediately began running emergency procedures, attempting to restart the engines while the captain contacted air traffic control. Their voices were calm but urgent. They knew every decision mattered now. Without engine power, the aircraft had become a massive glider, slowly losing altitude with every passing minute as they searched for a possible airport within reach. In the cabin, flight attendants quickly shifted into emergency mode. Though they tried to keep their expressions calm, their movements were faster and more serious than before. One attendant walked briskly down the aisle, checking seat belts and asking passengers to remain seated. Her quietly spoke into a phone connected to the cockpit. The change in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Passengers who had been relaxed moments ago now sat stiffly in their seats, whispering worried questions to one another. Emily watched everything carefully. She could tell the crew was doing their best to stay composed, but the tension in the air was growing stronger by the second. Emily noticed 2 flight attendants standing near the front galley, speaking in hushed voices. One of them kept glancing toward the cockpit door, while the other held a small emergency manual. Emily didn't need to hear their words to understand the seriousness of the situation. In hospitals, she had seen doctors whisper like tea had only during the most critical emergencies. Her instincts told her something had gone terribly wrong with the aircraft. She slowly took a deep breath to steady herself. Fear was natural, but panic would only make things worse. Around her, passengers were beginning to sense the same thing she had already realized. Then the intercom suddenly clicked, breaking the tense silence. Every passenger immediately looked toward the overhead speakers. The captain's voice came through, calm but clearly strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently experiencing a serious technical issue. Our crew is working closely with air traffic control to resolve the situation. For your safety, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The MS Sage was short, but its meaning spread through the cabin instantly. A serious technical issue at 32,000 feet could mean many things, but none of them sounded good to the passengers listening carefully. The announcement triggered a wave of anxiety across the aircraft. Some passengers began whispering nervously, while others closed their eyes in silent prayer. A teenager, boy asked his father if the plane was going to crash. A woman several rows ahead covered her mouth, trying to hold back tears. The quiet murmur of fear slowly grew louder as uncertainty filled the cabin. Emily could feel the tension like a physical pressure in the air. She had seen similar reactions in hospital waiting rooms, and families feared the worst about their loved ones. Fear spreads quickly in groups, and if it wasn't controlled soon, panic could take over. Suddenly, a man sitting near the middle aisle slumped sideways in his seat. The woman next to him gasped as he lost consciousness. At the same time, another passenger across the aisle began breathing rapidly, clutching his chest as panic overwhelmed him. The flight attendants rushed over, but the growing tension in the cabin worried questions. The atmosphere was quickly turning chaotic. Emily felt her training take over automatically. Situations like this required someone to stay calm and take action before made it difficult to calm everyone at once. Passengers began standing up to look. Ear spread even further. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up carefully. She approached the nearest flight attendant and introduced herself quickly. "I'm a registered nurse," she said calmly. "Let me help." The attendant's face immediately showed relief. Emily knelt beside the unconscious passenger and gently checked his pulse. It was steady but fast, likely caused by stress. She asked another passenger to bring water while she positioned the man safely in his seat. Then she turned to the passenger who was hyperventilating, speaking softly and guiding him through slow breathing exercises. Her voice was steady and reassuring, cutting through the panic around them. Within minutes, the atmosphere near Emily began to shift. Passengers who had been panicking started following her breathing instructions. "Slow breath in and slow breath out," she repeated calmly. The frightened man gradually regained control of his breathing. The unconscious passenger slowly opened his eyes, confused but stable. The flight attendants watched with gratitude as Emily continued moving through the aisle, speaking to passengers and reassuring them. Her calm presence acted like an anchor in the middle of chaos. Yet none of the passengers knew that the situation in the cockpit was still growing more serious with every passing minute in the silent sky. As the plane glided silently through the dark sky, the pilots were working against time. With both engines down, the aircraft had become nothing more than a massive glider drifting through the cold night air. The captain carefully calculated the distance to the nearest regional airport, knowing they had only one realistic chance to reach it safely. Every second mattered. Without engine power, the plane was slowly losing altitude. In the cockpit, warning lights flashed and instruments beeped softly as the co-pilot continued attempting emergency restart procedures. Outside the windows, the sky was dark and endless, and the quiet glide of the aircraft made the situation feel even more unsettling. Inside the cabin, panic was slowly spreading from row to row. What had begun as nervous whispers was now turning into open fear. Some passengers clutched their seats tightly, their knuckles turning white. Others began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the uncertainty of what might happen next. A middle-aged man sitting near the aisle pressed his hand against his chest, breathing rapidly as fear took control of his body. He looked around helplessly, convinced he might be having a heart attack. The tension inside the aircraft was rising quickly, and the flight attendants were struggling to keep everyone calm at once. Emily noticed the man immediately. Her training kicked in without hesitation. She quickly moved down the aisle and knelt beside him, speaking in the calm and steady tone she had learned during long hospital shifts. She gently checked his pulse and watched the rise and fall of his chest. His heartbeat was fast, but it was clear that panic, not a medical emergency, was causing his symptoms. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm and guided his breathing slowly. "You're okay," she said softly. "Just breathe with me. Slow breath in and slow breath out. You're going to be fine." Gradually, the man's breathing began to slow. The fear in his eyes softened as Emily continued speaking calmly to him. Several nearby passengers watched quietly, noticing how her calm presence seemed to change the atmosphere around them. A flight attendant hurried over and whispered a quick thank you while checking on the surrounding passengers. Emily nodded and continued helping. The man regained control of his breathing. For a moment, it felt as if the chaos inside the cabin had paused. But the situation outside the aircraft remained critical, and the pilots were still racing against time. Moments later, one of the flight attendants returned, her expression serious but hopeful. She leaned closer to Emily and spoke in a low voice so the nearby passengers couldn't hear. "The captain wants to know if you can help calm everyone," she said. "People are starting to panic across the cabin." Emily looked up, surprised by the request. She had only been helping a few passengers nearby. She hadn't expected the crew to rely on her in such a large way. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed her mind. She was still a rookie nurse with less than a year of experience. Emily hesitated. Her heart beat faster as she considered the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. Speaking to a few patients in a hospital room was one thing. Speaking to an entire airplane full of frightened passengers was something completely different. She wasn't a public speaker or a trained crisis leader. She was simply a nurse who'd been doing her best to help people in a difficult moment. For a second, she wondered if someone else might be better suited for the task. But the flight attendant's hopeful eyes told her the crew needed help immediately. Emily slowly stood and looked down the length of the cabin. The sight in front of her made the decision clear. Dozens of frightened faces stared anxiously around the plane. A young child clung tightly to his mother's arm, while an elderly couple held hands silently. Several passengers were whispering prayers under their breath. The fear in the cabin was real, and it was spreading quickly. In that moment, Emily realized something important. These people didn't need a perfect leader. They just needed someone calm enough to remind them they weren't alone. She took a slow breath and nodded to the flight attendant. A few moments later, the intercom clicked again. Passengers looked up instantly, expecting another announcement from the captain. Instead, a calm and unfamiliar voice filled the cabin. "Hello, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm a nurse on board this flight." Her voice was gentle but steady, carrying clearly through the speakers above each row. Some passengers looked at each other in surprise, but the quiet confidence in her tone immediately caught their attention. "I know this situation is frightening," Emily continued calmly, "but the pilots and crew are working very hard to guide us safely to the nearest airport. Right now, the best thing we can do is stay calm and support each other." Her voice had the same reassuring warmth she used with nervous patients in the hospital. The effect was immediate. The whispers in the cabin began to fade as people focused on her words. Even the passengers who had been crying moments earlier paused to listen carefully. "Let's all take a slow breath together," she said gently. "Breathe in slowly, and now breathe out." Passengers began following her instructions almost without thinking. The simple act of breathing together created a sense of unity inside the cabin. Emily continued guiding them through a few more calm breaths, her voice steady and patient. The tension in the air slowly began to loosen. Panic that had once spread quickly through the plane was now fading, replaced by a quiet sense of shared calm. Flight attendants exchanged relieved glances as they watched the passengers settle down. The transformation was remarkable. People who had been panicking minutes earlier were now sitting quietly, breathing slowly, and focusing on Emily's reassuring voice. Her words reminded them that the situation Tyon, while serious, was still under control. In the cockpit, the pilots finally spotted the lights of the small regional airport ahead. The runway glowed faintly in the darkness, giving them a narrow path to safety. Without engines, the aircraft continued descending silently toward the ground like a massive glider. The captain carefully adjusted the controls, lining the plane up with the runway. Every movement had to be precise. The co-pilot monitored the altitude and speed closely, while Air Traffic Control cleared the runway below. Inside the cabin, Emily finished her final calming instructions just as the aircraft drew closer to the ground. Passengers held their breath as the runway lights grew brighter through the windows. Then suddenly, the wheels touched the pavement. The plane bounced lightly, before settling firmly onto the runway. The sound of rubber meeting asphalt echoed through the cabin as the aircraft rolled forward, gradually slowing down. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The entire plane seemed frozen in disbelief. Then cheers erupted from every corner of the cabin. Passengers clapped, cried, and hugged each other as relief washed over them like a wave. When the plane finally stopped and the doors opened, passengers stepped out onto the runway with shaking legs, but grateful here. Many of them were talking about the same thing as they walked toward the terminal. They praised the pilots for landing the powerless aircraft safely, but they also spoke about the calm voice that had kept them together when fear almost took over. Later that night, the captain found Emily standing near the terminal entrance, still processing everything that had happened. He smiled warmly and walked over to her. "Tonight," he said, "you didn't just act like a nurse." Emily looked at him curiously as he continued. "You acted like a leader." His words stayed with her long after the passengers had gone home. That night, HT had changed something inside her. From that moment on, Emily Carter was no longer just a rookie nurse who had boarded an ordinary flight. She had become the calm voice people remembered when everything seemed ready to fall apart.